What this will mean is our ability to better invest in our children, in our schools, in our healthcare, in our roads, in our safety. It means investing in opportunities for our neighbors. It means building a brighter tomorrow.
We don't need the funds. This is just about ideology, Mr. President. And we have to understand that this is not who we are. Washington, as I said earlier, we do things different. And not having an income tax is part of our culture. We don't need one, we don't want one, and we should vote this bill down.
That was part of the 2021 debate in the Senate over the bill that passed by one vote to create the state capital gains tax. Hello and welcome to The Impact. I'm Mike McClanahan. In a highly anticipated decision, the Washington Supreme Court upheld the new state capital gains tax, which is due starting next month. The controversial tax was challenged on constitutional grounds by multiple plaintiffs who argued that it represents an unconstitutional income tax. The 2021 bill that created the tax explicitly described it as an excise tax imposed on the sale or exchange of long-term capital assets. Last year, a Superior Court judge ruled the tax unconstitutional, but with a 7-2 ruling on March 24th, the Washington Supreme Court reversed that decision. The majority opinion written by Justice Deborah Stevens concluded, quote, "The capital gains tax is a valid excise tax under Washington law because it is not a property tax. It is not subject to the uniformity and levy requirements of Article 7, Sections 1 and 2 of the Washington Constitution," end quote. The dissent opinion written by Justice Cheryl Gordon McLeod and signed by Justice Charles Johnson concluded that capital gains are income, income in Washington is considered property, and property tax is subject to a 1% annual cap, so the 7% capital gains tax is unconstitutional. The new tax is a 7% tax on long-term capital gains. Long-term means held for 1 year or longer. It applies to the sale of long-term investments above $250,000, such as stocks, bonds, cryptocurrency, and other assets. It applies to individuals, married couples, and domestic partners. It does not apply to corporations. First payments are due on or before April 18th, 2023. There are several exemptions. The capital gains tax does not apply to real estate, certain retirement accounts like 401ks and IRAs, timber, certain livestock, and depreciable business assets. There's also a standard deduction of the first $250,000 of capital gains per year per individual, married couple, or domestic partnership, adjusted annually for inflation. The sale of a qualified family-owned small business is exempt. There's also an exemption for up to $100,000 for very large charitable donations above $250,000. The money raised by the tax is earmarked for child care assistance in public schools. The State Department of Revenue estimates that the capital gains tax will apply to about 7,000 households in Washington. The agency now projects the new tax will bring in $3 billion over the next 5 years, an average of $580 million a year. One of the strongest supporters of the proposal is a group that has been pushing for a change to Washington's tax structure for several years. Joining me now is Andy Nicholas, a senior fellow with the Washington State Budget and Policy Center. Andy, your organization has been pushing for a change in Washington's tax structure for a number of years, specifically with this proposal. Thanks for your time today. What does this ruling mean for Washington taxpayers from your perspective?
Well, thanks, Mike. It's great to be here. Big fan of the show, so it's great to be here. Just want to start off. It's a great day to be a Washingtonian. It's also a great day to be my son, Simon. He's 7 years old today. It's his birthday. Happy birthday, buddy. So yeah, I mean, this is a really big deal for our state. We had a decisive 7-2 ruling upholding an equitable new excise tax on extreme stock profits from the wealthiest Washingtonians. This is going to make a big difference in a lot of people's lives. The tax is going to generate $500 million in new funding for childcare, early learning, schools, things that are sorely needed in communities across the state. And it's going to be a really meaningful step toward rebalancing Washington's notoriously upside-down tax code. We have a very regressive tax code in which the poor and middle-income folks in our state pay up to 6 times more of their incomes in state and local taxes compared to those at the very top. And with this ruling today, it means the wealthy are going to finally start to pay what they owe to support the common good. So again, it's a really great time. We're really making progress as a state, and it was gratifying to see that the court uphold this tax in such a decisive way.
So one of the claims about this ruling, about the bill too that passed back in 2021, was that it would be the opening or the first step towards a broader state income tax. Do you agree that that's in the cards now? Is that something that you think is likely to at least, that we're going to see a push for that here in Washington State?
No, I think this is fear-mongering from a lot of millionaires and billionaires, or rather a small handful of millionaires and billionaires who don't want to pay what they owe to support the common good. And the reality is that this tax is going to affect just the wealthiest 0.2% of the population. As I mentioned, it's going to generate $500 million for schools, childcare, early learning. And so, the court was very clear. This is a 7-2 decisive ruling that this is a legal excise tax, a valid excise tax on the transaction of receiving, extreme over $250,000 in profits from the sale of corporate stocks and bonds. And so it's only going to affect, 7,000 some odd very wealthy people in Washington State, but the revenues from the tax are going to do a ton of good for people and communities across the state.
So more of a general point of contention about income tax revenue or capital gains tax revenue too. In most states categorize that as part of income tax revenue. But either way, that type of revenue, stocks and bonds, can be volatile. And so do you think it's risky to sort of place important functions of state government, or in this case, to provide for schools or school construction, and to tie that to something that is considered volatile?
Well, the law has been structured very deliberately, very carefully by lawmakers, and we as an organization worked closely with them and community partners to address that and make sure it's going to be a reliable and dependable source of funding for schools and early learning. And so the estimates from the state economists are quite clear. It's going to generate about $250 million for funding this year, and then another $500 million in the following years, and that's what they're projecting for 4 years out at least. So it's been deliberately structured to be a dependable and reliable source of funding for schools, childcare, early learning, super important investments.
One of the comments from leading Senate Republican figure during the debate on this was that the state's tax structure for most residents is pretty close to the national average. I believe the figure was 10.1% tax burden in general for Washingtonians compared to around 9.7 nationally. Does that mesh with your research on tax policy and basically what, your perspective?
No, I think it's been very well studied and determined that Washington has an extremely upside down or a regressive tax code. For poor and moderate income Washingtonians, you can pay up to 1/5 of your annual incomes in state and local taxes. By contrast, if you're at the very top, you're in the top 1%, meaning you make a minimum of $660,000 per year. I mean, that's the cutoff, the minimum. You're paying less than 3%. And the distance between those two, that 1/5 for low and middle income Washingtonians and just 3% for the top 1%, that's wider in our state than it is in any other state in the country. We've got to start making progress on fixing that, creating a more equitable and dependable tax code. And that's what this ruling does. It moves us into a position where the wealthy few are going to finally start paying what they owe to support the common good.
One company made a very public announcement about relocating based on the decision. That was another concern that was raised by critics of the policy before the bill passed in 2021. Are you concerned about some of the highest earners in the state leaving and taking the potential future capital gains revenue with them?
No, that's really more fear-mongering from a handful of millionaires and billionaires who don't want to pay what they owe to support the common good. But the good news is that there are thousands of wealthy Washingtonians who will pay the tax, many of them who are happy to do so. Sharon Chen, former employee of Microsoft who's done very well. I can go down the list of people who have signed on and said, no, this is great for our communities. We're going to stay right here. We're going to pay this tax. And so, this notion that millionaires leave whenever their taxes, tick up a little bit has been thoroughly researched and thoroughly debunked. What your viewers really need to know about what's going on is, in any given year, the number of people of any income level who move from one state to another is very low. We have very low interstate migration rates right now. Wealthy people are actually significantly less likely than non-wealthy people to move from one state to another. And the reason is obvious. They have significant ties to their local communities. They have business interests here. They can't just uproot customers and supply chains and family. Moving is a really big, expensive deal. And so researchers have looked at this. They found the real reason that people tend to move, and again, not many of them do, is because they're seeking housing costs. They're, to lower housing costs. They're looking for jobs. They've got family reasons. Taxes are not a primary reason. That's true of wealthy people. It's true of all people. And so, the good news is that this tax is actually going to make our state more competitive. We're going to get $500 million per year for more funding channeled through communities for early learning, childcare, schools. That's going to make Washington a much more attractive place for people of all walks of life to want to be here. And so, again, this is just more fear-mongering from people who don't want to pay the tax. The individual that you mentioned doesn't even live in Washington state. He lives in Texas, and so this is a very empty threat. He changed the address on his corporate letterhead. This is not going to have any impact on communities. And again, this is really going to be great for our state economy and for our overall competitiveness as a state.
So in 2022, there was the beginning of an initiative campaign to put a repeal initiative on the ballot. It sort of fizzled out. There was, I don't think it progressed to the signature gathering phase, and the response from the organizers was that they were waiting until the ruling on this case, which we now have, the March 24th ruling, before making a decision. Are you worried about an initiative campaign? In the past, voters have rejected a straight-up income tax numerous times in Washington state. Do you think this would be vulnerable?
What we know is that voters really want a more balanced and a more equitable tax code, and that's exactly what this does. And they attempted to do this a year ago. The polling on that initiative to repeal this $500 million in funding for childcare and early learning polled terribly, not surprising. Washingtonians very strongly value those kinds of investments, and they very much want a more equitable, more balanced state and local tax code. So I think the public is on our side. Polling shows that, again, people strongly support a more equitable tax code, and that's the direction that we're moving thanks to this really important victory, 7-2, pretty overwhelming victory in the court.
If we could briefly address what other targets or what policies are you focused on now related to taxes?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of momentum within community organizations around this sort of extremely wealthy wealth tax, a tax on financial assets over $250 million, over $250 million is what's really being talked a lot about now. It's a wealth tax on stocks, bonds, financial assets, total holdings from a very tiny sliver of extremely wealthy individuals. It would raise billions of dollars for schools, for people with disabilities, for a host of things that would do a lot of good across our state. And so it's something that we support as an organization and that we're seeing a growing momentum around from people and communities across the state.
Well, we're out of time. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much. Andy Nicholas, the Washington State Budget and Policy Center. We appreciate your perspective.
Thanks so much.
Still ahead on The Impact, an organization that has been an outspoken opponent of the capital gains tax is the Washington Policy Center. WPC President Mike Gallagher joins us after the break. Some of the most prominent criticism of the capital gains tax policy has come from the free market-focused Washington Policy Center. Joining me now is President and CEO of that organization, Mike Gallagher. Thank you for your time today. Your organization, specifically Jason Mercier, has been very outspoken, probably the most outspoken person on the opposite side of this policy since the since the bill was passed. What do you think this means for Washington?
Well, Jason's been a proponent of our zero state income tax for over 20 years at the Washington Policy Center. So we're a free market think tank. A key part of that free market philosophy is the government taking as little as it can to accomplish its mission from the entrepreneurs and families of Washington State, and Jason's been a fierce proponent of it. And last week, on March 24th, we took a setback with the Supreme Court decision that for the first time created an income tax in this state.
So supporters of the capital gains tax say Washington has an extremely regressive tax structure. They argue that this tax will only be felt by the wealthiest individuals in the state and that the money will go to provide education. It's going to go towards schools and even child care programs. So what's your perspective?
Well, all of those assertions are false, is our position, and it's borne out by the truth and by the facts. Right now, the state has designed a tax that they intend to only have hit high income earners. However, those income earners can leave the state. They can also move assets out of the state. And when that happens, the job creation, the innovation, and the other benefits of that investment goes somewhere else. And as we said right away when we saw the ruling, why would Washington State be helping Texas and Florida attract the future entrepreneurs of from Washington State? It's a big mistake. So that policy is flawed in that way. Second, when you look at capital gains is not a constant stream of revenue. In fact, it varies with the performance of capital assets like stocks and bonds. And when stocks are down, the state doesn't get the revenue that it budgets for. So it's a very weak source of income for the state to capture as a policy matter. And when it comes to regressivity, taxing those who have less more, that's called our sales tax. And the Washington Policy Center and Jason have been a proponent of a sales tax cut for a long, long time. Right now, our sales tax rate is so high, when you pay that extra 2%, 3%, when you go to the grocery store for an automobile, for normal goods and services, it hurts the poor a lot more than it hurts the wealthy who are better able to afford it. So all of those arguments have been refuted.
So how do you see the real world impact of this policy then? Is there a transfer of wealth involved that people will feel?
Well, we're already seeing it now. You had Fisher Investments announce that they were going to leave Washington State and move to Texas. And with them go a number of jobs, over 1,000 jobs that could go with them on that move. And that's just the one publicly stated company that's making that decision. Anyone who's in wealth management in this state is looking at alternatives. If you are contemplating starting a family-owned business, which at some point in time you would like to sell to give the proceeds to your family, which is kind of the American way, you have to be very careful about thinking about doing it here in Washington State when there's a 7% tax that now applies to that will not apply in other states around the country. And again, why we're making Seattle create a disadvantage for Seattle to create jobs when we have 34% back to work in downtown Seattle, why we're doing that and helping Miami and Austin, Texas, is beyond me. It just doesn't make a lot of policy sense if this state wants to create and attract new jobs.
So in the ruling that upheld the state's capital gains tax, the Washington Supreme Court ruled that the legislature did not create an income tax, but a capital gains excise tax, basically as advertised. Is this issue settled?
First of all, that opinion, I encourage everyone to read it because it leaves you scratching your head of how an excise tax can be attached to income and not be an income tax. And when 49 other states, multiple other countries, and the Internal Revenue Service all refer to the same exact type of tax as an income tax. But nevertheless, the court went forward and came forward with that concoction, which is unique in the world, that this is now an excise tax, and it will create significant challenges for wealth creation here in this state going forward.
There are some in the tech community, the entrepreneurial community, who have said that, basically that as a matter of principle, that they support the capital gains tax, and that that employees would want to come somewhere with the sorts of the sorts of environments that can be created with funding from a capital gains tax. What do you think about that? What's your perspective on that?
So take one step back, and if you're a tech entrepreneur, you're pretty smart. You've got to be good at things like math. Right now, state revenue is at a record level. It's nearly doubled over 10 years. 100% growth in 10 years. There's more than enough revenue to fund every need in this state. The state does not need this tax revenue. All of those goods and services that those tech entrepreneurs might be attracted to will continue going forward. They've been provided to this point without it. It's not necessary to provide it going forward. And so the revenue that the state collects off its existing tax structure is more than sufficient to fund smart government.
What do you think is the next step at the legislative level?
At the legislative level, that'll be up to the majority to decide that. And in Olympia, that's not anyone who's embracing the free market at the moment. And they have options. The concerns that we have, and we've stated these, is that the rates could change. They could take that $250,000 exclusion and drop it down. And there already was a bill to drop it down as low as $15,000 this year. So this tax that becomes only on the wealthy becomes much more on everyone who has sold stock and made over $15,000. That's the nature of these taxes. Once they're in, the ratchet gets turned down. Also, there's the notion of changing the exclusion amount, which right now is $250,000. So the tax can be tuned. It's also a concern that this could be applied to the same theory that was approved by the court, could be applied to the real estate excise tax, that you could start taxing gains on personal real estate. And these are highly problematic. Those create even more of a headwind. And as Jason Mercier, who again works at the Policy Center, in February of 2021, he interviewed a tech entrepreneur who said every time that the state talks about raising taxes, it frightens away future businesses. And we're not just talking about it now, it's happening on April 18th.
There was an initiative campaign to repeal the capital gains tax that was launched and then suspended before really it even got to the signature gathering phase, I believe, certainly before it was certified. And so organizers said it was halted pending the outcome of this lawsuit. But there was reportedly polling that suggested the initiative may be unlikely to pass. Now, a new law requires all tax repeal initiatives to list the budgetary impact on the ballot. Do you think voters would reject this tax if it were on the ballot?
Voters in this state are incredibly smart on this issue. 10 different times an income tax has been on the ballot, and 10 different times it's been rejected by differing margins, most recently by nearly 60-40 opposed to the creation of an income tax. We are quite confident, I'm confident, I wouldn't have moved back here from Virginia, which is a relatively moderate tax state. I wouldn't have moved here if I thought that there would be a realistic possibility that the people of this state would embrace a new income tax. So I'm optimistic that we're turning the page, we're starting a new chapter, and from the Policy Center perspective, our perspective has not changed. We are for a zero-state income tax, which is in our Constitution, and that is within the reach of the people to take that back.
With one of the plaintiffs in the challenge, the Freedom Foundation, they issued a press release about the ruling, saying that the organization is already laying the groundwork for a challenge, and that, basically they would appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. Do you see that happening?
Well, first, Rob McKenna did a fantastic job representing the side of entrepreneurs, investors, and the heritage of our state and our Constitution with zero income tax. He did a great job. There are two different angles of federal appeal. One is to appeal directly to the U.S. Supreme Court. The other is what's called the Dormant Commerce Clause. It was an argument raised in the case to elevate that to the federal court and pursue that. Both of those are problematic for different reasons. One, the U.S. Supreme Court takes very, very few cases. It gets to choose which cases it would like to hear. That one's a reach. It's not impossible. This case is so unique in the sense of creating an excise tax out of thin air that there could be interest. That could be one viable path. And the other on the dormant commerce clause, that would be just another federal case, which takes a long period of time. In the meantime, you have the chilling effect of this tax setting into our economy here in Washington during a time of high inflation and during a time of high economic uncertainty. And that would continue during the pendency of that case. So those are each have their challenges when it comes to actually solving our problem.
I'm afraid we're out of time. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Mike Gallagher, President and CEO of the Washington Policy Center. We appreciate your perspective.
Enjoyed it. Look forward to coming back.
Thanks for watching. Please join us next week for more in-depth interviews you won't find anywhere else. Have a great week.